Welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for another installment of the Research Webinar Series hosted by our team here at the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute, or MVLRI. The goal of MVLRI is to expand Michigan's capacity to support new learning models, engage in active research to inform new policies in online and blended learning, and strengthen the state's infrastructures for sharing best practices. We also just like to point out that MVLRI is a division of MVU, or the Michigan Virtual University, which is a nonprofit organization whose mission is advancing K-12 education through digital learning, research, innovation, policy, and partnerships. MVU is also the parent company of the Michigan Virtual School, which is a supplemental state-sponsored virtual school. Michigan LearnPort, which is an online professional development portal for K-12 educators and personnel, and MyBlend, which is a blended learning initiative providing K-12 schools with resources, products, and services to personalize learning options for their students and improve student achievement. Before we get started here, just a quick disclaimer. This webinar will be recorded and shared publicly. Consequently, anything shared during this webinar, including chat comments, could be shared publicly. This webinar may represent a presenter's or an attendee's personal views, opinions, conclusions, and other information which do not necessarily reflect those of MVU and/or the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute and are not given nor endorsed by MVU/MVLRI unless otherwise specified. Dennis, no, that does not include private chats. Those private chats will remain private and they will not be accessible by us. Thank you, though. That's a great question. Our presenter today is John Watson. John is CEO of the Evergreen Education Group, which he founded in 2000. Evergreen is a leading consulting and advisory firm focused on K-12 education with an emphasis on educational technology, policy research, and market intelligence. John has developed and managed Evergreen's projects with school districts, charter schools, state agencies, private schools, state virtual schools, nonprofit organizations, and content and technology companies. Evergreen clients include public schools and agencies, nonprofit organizations, and other companies. John is the lead researcher and writer for Evergreen's annual National Education Policy Report, Keeping Pace with K-12 Online and Blended Learning. He has authored the series of white papers titled Promising Practices in K-12 Online Learning for INACOL and State Education Reports for California, Missouri, and Maryland. John's work has been cited in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Education Week, and many other media outlets. He has been invited to advise state legislators, boards of education, and charter school commissions in Maine, Idaho, Iowa, Missouri, and elsewhere. He is a frequent speaker at conferences including the INACOL Blended and Online Learning Symposium, the Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development, and the National School Boards Association. He has planned and delivered training days for educators in California, Colorado, Michigan, Minnesota, Idaho, Tennessee, and elsewhere. Prior to founding Evergreen, John was Director of Business Development for eCollege, where he was instrumental in developing the company's K-12 strategy. Prior to that position, he taught science in an outdoor school in Colorado, tutored students in Hawaii, and led students on experiential adventures in Maine, Vermont, and Belize. In addition to education, he has worked in fisheries biology and a variety of natural resource and conservation positions. John holds a BA from Middlebury College and an MS and MBA from the University of Michigan. With that, I will hand it over to John.
Justin, thank you so much. It's really great to be here this afternoon. As I'm sitting here listening to your opening, also just watching the chat comments coming in, and thrilled to have a really great group of people and organizations. Justin, I'll also mention that the setup here of using the PDF version of slides is slightly different to me than what I've done in the past. I think I am doing this correctly, but if not, please jump in. Also ask Justin, you, and as well as Joe and Catherine, if anything is coming in the chat window that I don't see that you would like me to touch on or any hands raised or anything like that, please feel free to jump in. And I will encourage everybody to please participate. Jump in with questions, comments, anything that I'm saying that you agree with or even more so disagree with and want to mention or ask a question or anything else, please jump into the text chat or raise a hand and we'll have a good conversation. As Justin mentioned, what I'm going to be presenting on today is our 11th annual edition of the Keeping Pace with K-12 Digital Learning Report. This research is made possible by a wide-ranging set of sponsors. You can see who they are there on your screen. I also see quite a few organizations that are sponsors or have been sponsors or have been are folks or organizations that we've worked with in the past at one point or another. So I'll just say hi to the folks from Florida Virtual and Quality Matters and the Friday Institute, and I'm probably, and Connections Education, of course, and I'm probably missing a few others as well. Oh, University of California, another organization that we've worked with in the past. So this is a really good group, and I strongly suspect that these are, although some of you I don't know personally, just based some of you I do, and based on the organizations, I suspect we have quite a few knowledgeable people. So if you want to dig in a little bit more deeply to some of the topics that I am touching on, again, please feel free to jump in with questions or comments, and I'd be glad to do that. I'm going to be going through quite a bit of information this afternoon. I'm also going to move through some of it fairly quickly, and in other areas talk a little bit more in depth about some of the data issues and data challenges than I typically do in keeping pace presentations. So this is a keeping pace presentation with a particular focus on data elements. In addition, we're going to be looking at the landscape generally, policy issues, and key trends, and looking forward to 2015. Also, along the way, I do expect Joe and perhaps others from Michigan to jump in and comment as well. In particular, Joe, once we get to discussions about state virtual schools and course choice and other things that are going on in Michigan, I'll see if you or any of the other NVU folks want to jump in. I want to start, though, with an observation about digital learning and what's happening in terms of adoptions. And simply an observation that what's happening within K-12 education is in some ways lagging behind the adoption of digital learning in both post-secondary institutions and also in corporate training and the military. If you think about where is the most activity now and when did it start the earliest, generally speaking, the progression has been from corporate training and the military to post-secondary, to charter schools at the K-12 level, to traditional public schools at the K-12 level, and then K-12 private schools. So we've seen that type of progression happening. We're into probably starting to our third decade or so when you think about some of the earliest activity at the corporate training and military going back to the early 1990s. We also see that K-12 digital learning is evolving towards much more activity at the individual district level. For this slide and this analysis, I choose 2004, which may seem rather arbitrary, but it's the year in which we released the first Keeping Pace report. And if you go back to that first Keeping Pace report, what you'll see is that much of the activity that we were documenting was at the state level in terms of state virtual schools, statewide charter schools, online charter schools, and other state level programs. And because these were operating at the state level, they tended to be mostly or entirely online. As we fast forward to 2014, we're seeing much more of the activity shifting towards district and individual school level activity. And we're seeing much more of it happening blended as well, simply meaning a combination of online and face-to-face activity. And I think that's happening for two reasons. I think first of all, the fact that so much activity is now at the district level or the school level means there's far more and far easier opportunities to engage students, at least partly face to face. So part of that shift from fully online to blended maybe in a sense a matter of expediency. At the same time, I think there's uh, an existing and perhaps growing perception that blended for most students is a better educational approach than fully online. And I think that's probably true in a lot of cases. I see Dennis's question, do I see this as a natural progression or one that's influenced by artificial external factors? Dennis, I assume by that question you're talking about, well, I'm not sure if you're talking about this progression, the corporate to private, or the state level to district level. So, and then I see your yes, so I think you're talking about the earlier one. I would say what we see is that there has, what we're looking at here, you could sort of overlay the extent to which there is a regulatory framework that creates some inertia. So there's less of that generally within corporate and within post-secondary, particularly because much of the activity early on was at the post-secondary level, and moving towards the traditional public schools, which have a variety of reasons why innovation is more difficult. I see your comment now being the question being more about state to district. Uh, Again, I do think that this one is a bit more of a natural progression. And I think what we see having happened in going back to 2004 and prior, there was uh, there was lots of interest in state level programs. I would say even though I chose 2004 as this starting point, it really goes back to the mid to late 90s and very early 2000s when we saw a lot of activity at the state level within state virtual schools and the statewide online charter schools. There were two things going on. One was the late 90s in particular were a time of state budget surpluses and a time when education was receiving a lot of attention as a political issue. And I think state governors and state legislators saw education as an area that they wanted to focus on. And with the dot-com boom that was happening at the time, going online seemed like a way to do that. And a relatively easy way to do that was by establishing state level organizations to do that. So it was a little bit more difficult to try to influence anything at the district level. Now, over the last 10 years, looking at the '04 to 2014 progression, because the vast majority of students, about 85%, depending on how you count, remain going to school in something that looks like a traditional school. That's where most students are, and so that's where much of the changes and innovation are happening. Similar question about going from fully online to blended. Is this natural or influenced externally or both? My perception is that that one is a bit more natural in the sense that most students need to have some sort of uh, very significant adult involvement in their learning, mentoring, let's say. And that is more easily done, or perhaps most easily done, with some significant face-to-face component. Now, I want to stress that I'm not saying that cannot be done online. It certainly can, and we absolutely see examples of successful online schools. But I think at the district level, much of that is more that interaction happens a bit more easily with a face-to-face component. Thanks for the questions and discussion already, and I encourage more questions along the way. It makes for a fun and interesting presentation. I'd love to hear what you're all interested in as well. One of the things that we've done in keeping pace this year is taken a step back and just try to think about the question, why are districts moving towards digital? And we came up with this list, and it's our view that when you think about the many reasons that are talked about, that they really boil down to these four uh, key reasons. Student achievement, so improving or increasing student achievement, improving student access to courses or to schools, uh, increasing or improving students' technology skills, and finally, cost. And I'll touch on technology skills for a minute. When you think about the online learning graduation requirements that Michigan and others have passed, in quite a few cases, uh, there are the states that pass those graduation requirements uh, did so because they felt like taking an online course or having an online experience, to use the language that Michigan has used, would inherently impart some technology skills to students, and that those technology skills are part of being college and or career ready, as we're well into the 21st century. And I think that's probably the case, that is accurate. I see Dennis's comment. I've got cost as the number, as one of the reasons for going digital, and Dennis mentions, I'm not sure the quality online learning at the K-12 level is really that much cheaper. Dennis, I couldn't agree with you more. And perhaps I should retitle this this slide to say something like reasons for going digital, whether they are real reasons or actualized reasons or not. I don't mean to suggest that there are lots of cases where moving online has reduced cost, as much as we absolutely see cases where schools think they're going to reduce cost and therefore are going digital for that reason. Now, there are some examples, undoubtedly. One example comes from the KIPP charter school chain. KIPP LA went to a blended approach specifically because they needed to reduce costs, and they were successful in doing so. But what we do see is that, in fact, moving to online or adding a significant blended learning program typically requires investment. And even if there's going to be some cost savings down the road, it's not until there's some significant investment. The second thing is cost effectiveness is tied to access as well. When you think about things like making sure that students have access to a wider range of courses than they may have in a small school, using Michigan as an example, let's say in the Upper Peninsula, students are unlikely to have access to high-level science and world languages courses. One way online is a cost-effective way of bringing in those types of courses. So if a school is adding those courses, it may be actually adding some cost, but it's far cheaper than doing so if it's online as compared to bringing in a new teacher to teach that class. I see Sue Verma's comment, providing flexibility of scheduling for high schoolers who want to do a million things. You know, that is right. Although I have to say, we don't usually see flexibility as a key reason given by schools, especially when they're starting to go into online and blended learning. We often see that as something that they recognize over time. And in fact, in a lot of cases, we see students saying, hey, this is what we love about it. We love the flexibility, but I'm not sure that we don't often see educators saying, yeah, we added this online component specifically because we wanted to provide more flexibility. I'm sure it's happened in some cases, but it's not a main one per se. See Scott's comment. It seems like schools have been pushing students who are least likely to succeed into online learning. What checks can a district institute to prevent this? And before I touch on that, Sue, your comment, sharing based on what students are telling you. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. When we've conducted student focus groups, we absolutely have many students telling us that they love the flexibility. What we intend to explain with this slide is the reason that we see school administrators decide for going into digital. So again, there's the distinction between what students really like, especially after they have that opportunity, versus what the school administrators say as what was the reason that they're going to it. Let me go back to Scott's question again, saying it seems like schools have been pushing students who are least likely to succeed into online learning. What checks can a district institute to prevent this? And then Paula's question, following up on Scott's question, when students at risk for failure, including students with disabilities, are enrolled in fully online learning, they don't appear to succeed, and schools don't seem prepared to support them. What checks should districts and programs put in place to prevent this problem? And then Anne from Florida Virtual mentioning that many times administrators are unprepared in terms of their own training, and she mentions the need for us to educate decision makers about best practices. Well, Anne's comment is exactly where I was going with my response, which is I think that there is a huge need to ensure that there is very active involvement with each student who is choosing a single online course or an online or blended course of study to make sure that it's right for that student. And this is a really, really tricky issue. And I have to say, I'm familiar with individual schools and districts who appear to be making very good choices and having good processes in place for this. But at the same time, it's unclear how you make sure that, those decisions are being made correctly. I would say, I know that, for instance, the accrediting organization Advanced Ed wants to, as part of its accreditation process, asks that each online provider, whether that's a supplemental provider like a Michigan Virtual or a school or a district, make sure that there is active counseling of each student. And I think that is really what you have to have happen to make sure that students aren't put in courses that are not appropriate for them. At the same time, and here's where it gets even a bit trickier, when we talk about course choice, which Michigan now is implementing, the idea that students should be able to choose an online course and have their funding flow to that to the course of their choice, you've got an incentive for districts to not allow students to take those courses because some districts at least will feel like they're losing that funding. And so we've got this issue of how do you make sure that if a district does that, it's doing so for a reason that is truly educationally appropriate and not simply an issue of being concerned about losing that funding. To me, that is a really tough nut to crack, and it's not clear that there's any single state that's figured that out and that we can point to and say, yeah, they've got that exactly right. Because as much as we can see good examples, I think there are some poor examples out there as well. Final thought on this issue. We have from time to time seen instances where schools or districts moved students into an online or blended program without their knowledge, acknowledgement, or permission. And I think that's absolutely a mistake. It's almost certainly a mistake from a public relations standpoint. I think it's probably almost certainly a mistake from a standpoint of what's educationally appropriate as well. And so I do think that there is that need to balance. And as Dennis is saying, difficulty is determining what is appropriate versus inappropriate. And ultimately, because when you think about state oversight and accountability mechanisms, you can't expect the state or whatever the accountability mechanism is, if you're thinking about, for instance, a charter school authorizer. I don't think you can expect them to know what's happening with every student. And so you have to have the right processes in place and make sure you have the right people who are in place and making decisions based on what's truly best for each student. I'm just making sure I'm caught up here on the questions. I think I am. Justin and other Michigan folks, if I've missed anything, please jump in. Um, the other way we think about this evolution is going from online to blended to what, in keeping pace, we're now calling digital. And the reason that we're talking about digital as opposed to either blended or online is that at the district level, we see a tremendous amount of activity. And as valuable as the blended learning definitions and categories that have been created by the Christian Institute, as valuable as they are, as they're really critically important, we're a little concerned that in 2014, what we see is schools trying to shoehorn their programs into a model so they can say it's rotation or flex or something like that, when in effect there are countless permutations. And so what we did in Keeping Pace this year is look at what's happening within district activity uh, through four lenses: digital content, digital platforms, devices, and teaching, thinking about each of them both in terms of what's happening online and what's happening within school buildings and what's happening in a combination of online and in school. And we looked at a couple of different lenses. We looked through the lens of what's happening uh, between high schools and elementary schools. And the reason I think this is important is because there are some differences. Now, I'll mention here that we are generalizing, and I'll mention here, I mentioned earlier that I would talk a little bit about what's our data source for all this. And I'll tell you, our data source for this, what I'm about to talk about, compared to some of the other things we're going to talk about, our data source is a little bit weaker here. We have talked to a number of schools and providers, and we tend to see these same types of use cases again and again, but there is not a single definitive study that's looked like anything like a representative sample of districts across the country that we can point to. So we are absolutely in the realm of this is our best educated guess, but it is an educated guess, and you can choose to either emphasize the guess part of that statement or the educated part of that statement. What we see in digital content is at the high school level, content is mostly used in a wide range of fully online courses, as well as content being used in physical classrooms to augment face-to-face instruction. At the elementary level, you rarely see full online courses. What you are more likely to see is skill-based adaptive math and ELA content. So I'm thinking about products like Dreambox and STMath and iReady and things like that. Those adoptions are usually at a school or a district level, whereas at the high school level, you're as likely to see teachers going out and individually finding that content as well. The elementary level, almost always that content is being accessed during regular class time under supervision of the classroom teacher. At the high school level, quite a bit of that activity may be online. Students may be accessing from home or during computer labs, credit recovery sessions, and that sort of thing. I want to stress also that what I'm talking about here is within traditional public schools. We'll talk about charter schools a little bit later, and that will be quite a bit different. When we think about platforms, so I'm thinking about the learning management system and the student information system. At the high school level, there is very often an LMS and an SIS being used as the base platforms. And a lot of times, schools are then choosing content that fits into that technology platform. They are also likely to be bringing in some additional content accessed within its own technology platform. At the elementary level, usually that content that we talked about, that skills software being used in math and ELA, is the platform is tied to the content. So again, if you're using a Dreambox or an iReady or something like that, the content and the platform go together. So they don't really have the concept of saying, okay, we're going to take that math content and drop it into a separate learning management system. They are the same thing, essentially. Content and platform have ramifications for what devices are being used. At the elementary level, we see a lot of use of tablets, and those tablets, iPads and others, are often preloaded with content that is tablet specific. So you see companies like Amplify and others that are selling a full tablet content package. The situation that you may well have heard about in Los Angeles getting a lot of attention because it was perhaps not the best tablet rollout was a situation where you had iPads and content wrapped together. You do see some use of laptops and desktops, but a bit less often than tablets. The high school level, you see devices being used, and they vary on what's being done. Um, Across all grade levels, content is increasingly being built for mobile devices, but at the high school level, those fully online courses usually still require a full computer, not a tablet. Might be a laptop, might be a desktop, but a full computer. And so when we go back to that content and the way that we see so much of the high school level activity being full courses, there you usually have to access those through some sort of computer. And then finally, we think about teaching. And I'll start again here with elementary. Elementary teaching, when you think about digital instruction, it's almost always teachers using classroom-based content. They're using the digital content in their own class. And it's the same teacher who would be teaching math, and now he or she is teaching math with the use of that online content. At the high school level, you may have some classroom-based teachers using digital content, but you also have, again, these online courses being taught by teachers who are at a distance with perhaps little or no face-to-face interaction with students. We also have quite a few alt-ed and independent study programs, and that's where you see a combination of online teachers and online and on-site mentors being used. So we see quite a bit of innovation and different types of activity there. All of this comes together in a number of important ways, but I would say using this graphic that comes from Andy Calkins at MVLRI, when you think about improving student achievement via digital learning, what you see is schools that are using digital learning strategies with a goal of individualizing or personalizing learning. And what you see is that as you go towards the right side of the x-axis, towards more extensive and then transformational use of digital learning, those are the implementations that are blended in those rotation and flip models. And then as you move towards the upper right quadrant, increasing the level of individualization, you move increasingly towards online, what the model calls, what Christensen's model calls, enriched virtual, but really in simpler terms, has a very significant online component. Blended, there's a tremendous amount of activity that in one way or another is blended. We continue to think that much of the most innovative activity has a very significant online component as well. And this graphic from NGLC seems to support that. I am going to pause for a couple of seconds, take a sip of water, and just see if I'm missing anything happening in the chat window. I see there's some discussion about students with special needs and in particular gaining personalized and differentiated instruction, and that is absolutely correct. In fact, a couple of years ago, we participated in a funding and finance study that was talking about examining how online and blended schools are funded, and there was this discussion of how much does it cost and should it cost relative to traditional face-to-face schools and classrooms, and then what should the additional funding be for special needs students. It was a really interesting outcome. And by the way, this has not been published anywhere that I'm aware of. But the discussion was around the idea that that online courses and schools are not substantially less expensive than other types of traditional face-to-face instruction, but that when you look at how much additional funding you need for special needs students, that it's a bit less of an increase because so much of the funding that goes into working with special needs students is to individualize and personalize that instruction. And online schools are doing that for everybody. So that argument, that finding, again, which I haven't seen published yet, but I hope it will be because I think it's really valuable. That finding was really this idea that as a base amount, online schools are not any less expensive or should not be any less, cost any less, but then they don't need as much of an increase for special needs students. Let me pause there before I move on and just ask Joe, I know I've been running through this quickly. Is there anything that you either want to mention relative to Michigan or anything you want to ask about, or should I just keep going?
I'm happy with you keeping going, John.
All right. Thanks, Joe. And I see Dennis mentioning the funding for virtual schools from NEPC, and if I get a chance, I'll come back and perhaps comment on that a bit later. I want to briefly touch on just a few district profiles that we did in Keeping Pace this year. I'm going to touch on these really quite quickly. The point that we make around these district profiles is that we are seeing districts do quite a number of different things with digital content and blended learning. So in this case, District of Columbia using has gotten quite a bit of attention for its blended schools, these whole school blended learning redesigns that have gotten NGLC and other fairly high profile funding. But as you can see, these are a total of 8 schools out of the 111 schools in the district. And I know that those folks that in DC are trying to figure out how they're going to scale from 8 schools to 111. At the same time, the district is using digital content with math digital content for 20,000 students, literacy content with more than 13,000 students. So they have these other efforts going on as well. They are tracking all of them to see what the results are. And the effort that's getting less attention in some ways is far, far more scalable. I'm going to go past this slide and go to a second one. And by the way, I see the comment from Paula, your question. The NEPC study is not the finance study that I was referring to. The one that I was referring to, we were involved along with INACOL and a school finance organization called Augenblick Palake and Associates. And again, to my knowledge, it hasn't been published. So DC is an example of a district where they have been focused on student achievement and how they increase student achievement. Lack of equal access, I think, is a critical ongoing issue. Many of you are joining us today from states that have very large rural areas that have significant numbers of schools that don't offer calculus, don't offer physics, don't offer world languages. These numbers come from the U.S. Department of Education. I think it's easy to forget how many students in the U.S. don't have access to that wide range of courses. And so what we see is even in some urban areas like Clark County in Nevada, launching online programs, in the case of Clark County, the Nevada Learning Academy, that is providing fully online courses, not only to CCSD students, but students statewide as well. In Las Vegas and Clark County, you also see them implementing at a school level an on-site approach in their E3 program, which they call Engage, Empower, and Exploring, with using Title I funds to create a one-to-one project using tablets. We see another example, Horry County Schools in South Carolina, creating a virtual school supplemental courses with providing all courses to a few students. They have created some of their own courses, and they're also using their own state virtual school as well to provide some courses, which leads us to a whole second category of analysis, which is around state virtual schools. State virtual schools remain an important category. These are programs that are created or funded by states to provide primarily supplemental online learning opportunities to students across the state. There are 26 states that have state virtual schools. They provided about 740,000 individual one semester course enrollments in school year 13-14. What we see is that Florida is by far the largest, providing about half of those enrollments. There's a handful of other quite large state virtual schools, North Carolina, Alabama, Georgia, and others. Michigan, I'll mention in a minute. Joe, I'll just see if you want to add anything about Michigan virtual in addition to what I'm about to say. What we also see in a few states, and I think Michigan is really the most prominent example of this, is state virtual schools that are evolving from having a role primarily as a course, as a supplemental online course provider, to playing very significant other roles as well in terms of the course choice program in Michigan and other ways as well. But what you can see very clearly from this graphic is that even though there are 26 states that have some sort of state virtual school, there are quite a number of them where they are really quite small. Joe, I see you're typing. I'll see if you want to add anything, or you may be. Yeah, go ahead, Joe. Jump in and what you want to add.
Yeah, thanks. And it's along the lines of the comment I left in the chat earlier. You know, Michigan is one of the top states in terms of a state virtual school, but in our work that we were looking at from last year's data, it really appears that only 5% or so of the virtual enrollments in the state of Michigan were through the state virtual school, which kind of leads credence to John's claim about how much of this is shifting down to the district level. And the challenge for researchers like John and others in the field here, those district snapshots are really nice opportunities, but they're so much of what's going on right now in our field is going, let's say, underground, or it's so localized it's hard to count. Michigan is fairly fortunate that in its student longitudinal data systems, one of the things that is collected is just a simple yes/no flag on whether the course was delivered virtually. And we're fortunate enough at the Research Institute here to be able to get access to that data and try to, as best we can, paint a statewide picture of the virtual enrollments that are going on in the state over a year. We released a report called Michigan's K-12, Michigan's report on online learning or virtual learning effectiveness, and that was for 12-13, and I think at that time we found that there were 185,000 enrollments in the state of Michigan, and this year's report, which we expect to come out in January, will overwhelm the number of enrollments that are available in the state. So one of the things we're seeing as kind of a research agenda item is, you know, what is being collected at an aggregate level that researchers can get their hands on? Because John, I got to imagine when you wrote up your districts, you guys had to expend significant manpower to come up with the information about the profile states, which are excellent to get and maybe a great qualitative addition to the field, but it's really hard for many states to give us an idea about what is really going on when you can't really trust the state virtual schools as much in terms of being representative or giving a good idea of what's going on in the state in terms of virtual learning.
Joe, that's exactly right. What we are able to get good numbers around the state virtual schools and some of the online charter schools as well. We don't have good numbers when it comes to district level activity, and so when we did these profiles that we did, and it's only a handful, there's 7 of them in the report, and we have several other projects right now that are expanding on that we'll be publishing over the next several months, and so we do have this growing list of profiles and case studies, which is not at all the same as having a really good data set. And I don't know that I know that nobody has a good data set. I know we would love to have one, and we are probably quite a ways from having that. In a lot of ways, there's a tremendous need that perhaps only the federal government is going to be able to address. It's a federal level effort, I think, that by the way, I noticed Scott asking about Joe's feed seeming louder than mine. Of course, I don't hear my own feed, but I did try to just adjust the volume on my microphone. So I'm hoping that may be a little bit better. Joe or Justin, if there's anything else I should do to adjust my volume, please let me know. Also want to go to David's comment here. Really good question. Have we considered looking into specific subject areas? And the answer is we consider all sorts of questions, and then we determine that they are going to be extremely difficult to answer, and so we don't pursue them. And this is really in that area. What I can say is that when you look at elementary versus high school, elementary does tend to be very, very heavily math, and secondly ELA, with far, far less uh, uh, activity or digital content or blended within any other subject areas. At the high school level, there's a much wider range where you've got all core courses, many elective courses, some courses that you would never see in a traditional high school that are being offered online, and a much wider range of usage. So really all over the map. In terms of what those numbers actually are, we don't know, and I don't believe anybody else knows either. And Joe, you had a question because maybe you do have some on this in Michigan.
Yeah, I think we have insight into it in Michigan. Hopefully my volume is a little bit better. If someone could chime in the chat, let me know it's not too loud now. Okay, great. So one of the things that we looked at, and here's just a really interesting perspective. So we have what's called Michigan's online course catalog. We're a choice state now, or an access state, depending on who you talk to. And when we look at the course titles that schools are making available, the ones that are most popular, for instance, for high school and middle school kids, both were foreign languages. Yet we know that from the data we've collected out of the state enrollments over both the past 2 years, the foreign language enrollments represent roughly about 4% of the enrollments in the state. They're not anywhere close to double digits, and they're not anywhere in the top level. For us, what happens in the state of Michigan, and I guess at one level it ought not to be very surprising, is that the top subject areas are the core, math, science, English, social studies. And I think part of why we see that is because graduation requirements are so strict in the state. We thought that maybe what we would see when we drill down more deeply, in fact, that well, the subject areas were hiding something from us. If we went down into mathematics, for instance, we would see that there's great variation between the percentage that takes Algebra 1, for instance, compared to the percentage that takes calculus. And while I think we can safely say there weren't a ton of students taking AP courses online, and I think that was probably in part underreported. We did see really good variation between grade levels. For instance, whether it was English 9, 10, 11, 12, those were the top 4 courses that students were taking in that subject area. So at least what gets flagged in the state of Michigan for virtual, it tends to be predominantly in the core subject areas, and the top enrolled courses are the kinds of courses that are the standard for graduation, not really elective courses in many people's minds.
Great points, Joe. And by the way, I don't think anybody was worried that you were too loud. It seems like I was a little too soft. So I think that I hope I'm better. I will mention that I don't know of any other state that has the level of data that Michigan now has, at least not published. Joe, if you know of any other states, please let me know because we don't know them. Other than that, and so I was thinking about that question from more of a national perspective. And Joe, you may see that Paul is asking where is this data published. So if you get a chance to put your report's URL in there, that would be useful. So I want to go to a different category here. And by the way, I know that we have about 10 minutes left. I'm probably going to fill that 10 minutes, but I will encourage anybody, if there's anything that we haven't talked about yet that you are curious about, jump in and I'll make sure that we attempt to address it in our final 10 minutes or so. Earlier, when I was showing the slide of state virtual schools, somebody, Sue Verma from Pennsylvania, said, well, my state is a little behind. You know, that's a really good example of why it's very difficult to answer the question, which states are doing doing the most around digital learning. And the answer is it's difficult to answer that because there are lots of different flavors. So where Pennsylvania does not have a state virtual school, Pennsylvania has a tremendous amount of activity within online charter schools and district schools as well. So the first category I was talking about was around traditional district schools. Charter schools are a second category, which is really important. Within charter schools, you've got two general categories. One is the online charter schools that are run by national organizations such as K-12 and Connections. Secondly, those that are independent, Primavera and ECOT as examples. And I should be careful in my language. I said run by K-12 or Connections. They're not actually run by K-12 and Connections. K-12 and Connections support schools that are created typically as their own school, have their own school board, and then contract with those organizations to provide a variety of services. When you look at these statewide online schools, many of which are charter schools, we see 30 states that have this type of school, including Pennsylvania. You also see that Pennsylvania has about 36,000 students in these types of schools. So Pennsylvania, in fact, has lots of online and blended learning activity, lots of activity within districts, I think, that are at least in part being influenced by the cyber charter schools as well. In this map, the purple states have fully online schools with few or no restrictions. The red states have some restrictions in terms of the number of online schools or the types of online schools or grade levels or different restrictions like that. We also see charter schools with what we're calling significant digital elements. And in the report, we got away from saying these are the blended charter schools for that reason of data and definitions and categories. We were reluctant to say this is a blended charter school and this isn't. In fact, these are quite different types of schools and different types of approaches. I'm reluctant to say some are blended and some are not. What I can say is that they all have significant digital elements. Similar to the online charter schools, some of them are affiliated with national organizations like Nexus are connection schools. Flex Academies in California are associated with K-12. Others started as on-site schools with significant digital elements and are now growing into multiple schools like Rocket Ship and Summit. Others were existing CMO chains that are adding these elements like Aspire and KIP. So you've got lots of different examples. What they have in common is that they tend to be schools that are taking different approaches to their physical classrooms and schools. So this is just a picture from KIP Empower in Los Angeles, showing you've got some students online on their computers to the right, some students in small group instruction in the middle and on the left there. So different types of approaches. This is a rendition of a Nexus school. I've visited their schools. They do look like this, or I should say the one that I visited looked like this. A bit more like a college building than a typical high school, so a very open approach that again looks more like perhaps a college commons or even a library than a school. But these do look quite different, and we don't tend to see a lot of traditional schools that have gone uh, quite this far. Joe, is there anything that you want to say about online or blended charter schools in Michigan before I move on?
One of the things you'll see in that next report that we're mentioning that's coming out in January and we'll do a webinar on later, we did break out what we call the virtual subset so that people could get a better idea of how students were doing when they went to a cyber school versus the virtual school versus what was being done at a local level. Unfortunately, I can't really talk about that yet because it's under review by the Department of Ed and our Center for Educational Performance and information, but that will be an upcoming webinar.
Fantastic. By the way, I see somebody made the comment that Nexus school looks like quite a capital output, and yes, I think I agree with that. That's one of the elements that charter schools are able to bring if they're affiliated with a national organization. In particular, they may have the ability to make more of an upfront investment. In other cases, even if they're independent, there are sometimes startup grants that they can tap into, although probably not at the level of being able to build a fancy new building. And I will say that at least the school I visited was actually within an existing shopping mall. It's not like they even built a new building, but what they did was they took an existing space and outfitted it quite nicely. Final two thoughts in our last 4 minutes or so, and then in a couple of minutes I will turn it back over to Joe or Justin for any final thoughts. Course choice is we've referenced earlier. There are these states that you see on the map that are moving, that either have or are moving towards allowing students to take online courses from one or more providers and allowing students the level of choice and having their funding flow to that provider. Michigan is among the early stage states, but is really being very, very thoughtful about how to implement a program like this. And after I'm done with just some closing thoughts, see if Joe wants to add anything about what's happening as far as course choice in Michigan. I'm going to go by a couple of slides to make sure we end on time and just give you a summary thought. Where we are as of the end of 2014, we think about student access and student outcomes as well. These are three of the maps that I've used throughout the presentation. And when you think about access, where we are right now is somewhat paradoxical. You know that we've seen that more students have more access to online and blended options than they ever have before. But there are very significant gaps in all these areas. All the blank states have students who don't have that same level of access to online courses or online or blended schools. With the increasing shift towards what's happening at the districts, as we've talked about, there are just huge gaps in really what we know and what we don't know about that level of activity. And finally, the areas where we know about outcomes tend to be those online charter schools, and to a lesser extent, state virtual schools. Those being discrete, independent schools or programs that we can really track and see how they're doing. As more activity happens at the district level, particularly in cases where those blended programs are part of an existing school, it's really hard for anybody outside the school to know what the outcomes are. And so I think that is one of the challenges that we are facing as a field as we look at 2015 and beyond. With that, Joe, I'm going to go back to you and see if there's anything that you or Justin or Catherine would like to add.
Yeah, on that point about kind of student access and outcomes and even transparency, I would encourage those attending to take a look at the Michigan Virtual Schools annual legislative report that gets published every December 1st. So you'll see our latest one out on our website, and I think Catherine's going to share a link to that site. One of the things that we did in this year's report that we have never done before that I thought was really fascinating was to break it out by the reason the student was coming to the virtual school. And when an enrollment is made at MVS, we track things like the reason was that there's a scheduling conflict or that the course was not available locally. It was the learning preference of the student. The child was there for credit recovery or other. There's these 5 categories that we look at. And across each of the subject areas, we disaggregated how students performed based on the reason that they were coming for us. And you'll see really substantially different experiences and levels of performance based on those kinds of reasons. And in the end of the report, one of the things that we're talking about and we have as kind of an agenda is that a lot of the conversation about virtual learning at present has been really focused on virtual teachers and virtual content and content providers, but the local supports make a huge difference. And at the end of the legislative report, there's some information there for those who may be interested about some of the projects that we're embarking on, whether it's better training mentors, which in the state of Michigan is someone who's employed by the school district that helps monitor and provide support, on-ground support for those virtual learners. And how do we go about educating them? And there's other things. We're going to be working on building a mentoring network, but I'd encourage you to take a look and see how some of those issues can play out differently. And then in terms of course choice, the mycourses.org website, which is the Michigan's online course catalog, it's micourses.org, has information in it about the enrollments that students can take in the state through the choice program, and it even includes performance data about how well students did in the previous year. So you'll be able to get information like how many enrollments were for that course and how many of those enrollments for students earned 60% or more. What we've seen in other states, I think we're continuing to see in Michigan, that at present for the first year of adoption, there's very little enrollments through that program, and part of it is an awareness issue, and maybe some of it's still immature in the field, but a lot of access and equity issues that the field still needs to deal with, both in how we create our courses and deliver those courses, but also in how we support those students on ground. I'll turn it back over to Justin then.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, John. John, I didn't know if you saw Scott's comment there about professional development being delivered virtually. I don't know if you wanted to make any final comments on
Sure,
that.
I did, Justin, and appreciate the opportunity to comment. Scott's question was, are we looking at how many districts are shifting teacher PD online? Seems like MOOCs would be ideal for this. We have not done any study of that. I can tell you that we are absolutely seeing some districts and states moving in that direction. Honestly, I don't know that it's really a game changer. We're not seeing huge changes in teacher PD because of that so far. There's certainly some potential there, but it's not clear that there are really any major differences because of some of the movement to online that's happening. If you can contact me through the website that's there if you're interested, and I can follow up with some additional thoughts. Just saying, closing, the report and many of the graphics that I showed are freely available at kpk12.com. We're also tweeting and blogging the blog on that site as well. Justin, Joe, Catherine, appreciate the opportunity to talk today, and thanks for your support as Keeping Pace sponsors and for all the fantastic work you're doing in Michigan and really nationally as well.
Thank you so much, John. This was fantastic. Thank you for kind of cultivating this incredible discussion. I think you were incredibly able to field all of those questions and be able to take the conversation in whichever way that our attendees needed it to go. So with that, we'll go ahead and close up today's meeting. We did want to go ahead and make mention of our next webinar, which will take place tomorrow, Thursday, December 11th at 1 p.m. This will be the first in a 4-part series of webinars in which we are hosting representatives from K-12 virtual schools to share some of their unique research needs. Tomorrow, we'll be hearing from Ryan Gravett and Jeff Simmons from Idaho Digital Learning Academy, Cindy Hamblin from Illinois Virtual School, and Joe Cozart from Georgia Virtual School. If you are on our mailing list, you'll be seeing some registration links for each of those in the four the 4 in the series. So if you have an interest in attending, please go ahead and register and come and participate in a great discussion. Lastly, I'll just close with the links for you to be able to email us, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn. Feel free to contact us if you have an interest in presenting something within our research webinar series, or if you just like to explore some opportunities to collaborate, we are always all ears. Thanks everyone for attending, and we hope to see you soon.